Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Samach Vav. Before we get started, I just want to make two short announcements. One is that there's Pesach learning opportunities on our site, all different options of things you can use to prepare for Pesach. You can find it on the menu bar called Pesach Learning. And so if you have time, I don't know, there's a war going on at least here. I don't know if everyone has any extra time, but if you do, definitely recommended. It will give you opportunities to learn things that are connected to the Seder and all different types of learning opportunities. The second thing is starting after Pesach. We're going to have from after Pesach to Shavuot. We're going to have another learning challenge of Masechet Menachot. So we will put up the materials soon to spread around and share with friends. It's a great way to get people into learning Gemara. It's like a small opportunity. It's a nice short Masechet, and finishing on Shavuot will be a nice opportunity for people to see them on Shavuot. So that is our next challenge. Okay, we are going to get started now with our daf. So we started off with this big machloket between the Baytusim and the Prushim and the rabbis about the date for Shavuot, or when we start counting the Omer, when we bring the Korban Omer, when we count, which the main thing being that it really affects when Shavuot comes out. So what we saw yesterday, and today we're going to eventually get back and review these. Okay, there's a study guide for today, so I'll share my screen and we can follow along. But in the first braita we saw, there were 5 arguments. Okay, we're going to see that some of these arguments overlap in the second braita. Okay, some people say the exact same thing as the people said in the earlier braita. We're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira in braita number 1 says one claim, and in the second braita he actually appears with a different claim. That's why it's always helpful to kind of chart them out and see everything in this kind of format. It helps you kind of visualize and see what's similar, what's different. So we have 5 claims. Today, what we're going to do eventually is get to all the rejections of a bunch of these arguments and say, we talked about yesterday, they're not the most convincing arguments, and Rava is going to come and give a whole slew of difficulties on the different arguments. So we ended in the second braita yesterday with the first opinion of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda about the 51, 52, 53. It's a bit of a strange claim. We'll come back to all that later. So now we're up to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira with the very bottom of Samach Hamud Bet. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira Omer no tzarich. We don't need your proof that you just said. But Harei Omer, I'll tell you, it says tispor lach. Okay, count for you, which is singular. This is exactly what Rabbi Eliezer said in the previous braita. He was the second opinion in the previous braita. Sfirat liya bebeitin. Yatzda Shabbat Breshit. Shesfira b'kol adam. Shesfirata b'kol adam. He says tispor lach is the pasuk, and it's in singular form. Why is it in singular form? Because it's trying to tell you that the counting is based on the court and not based on what day of the week, right? It's not something that anyone can figure out when we count, because if anyone can figure it out, if it was Sunday, everyone would know. It's always Sunday, and then everyone can figure that out on their own. But if it's Tzliya b'beitin, that means it's a date in the calendar, which is dependent on the court. And that's what he learned from Tispor Lecha. Again, exact same claim in this case, right? Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira said something else in the previous, okay? But he says, like Rabbi Eliezer in the first braita, in this braita. Rabbi Yossi Omer, third opinion. Mimocharat Shabbat. Mimocharat Yom Tov. When it says Mimocharat Shabbat, it really means Mimocharat Yom Tov. Okay, so far he didn't say anything. That's what all of them claim. It's the day after the first day of Yom Tov, not Shabbat. Ata Omer Mimocharat Yom Tov Oeinu Ela Mimocharat Shabbat Breshit. So now they ask the question. They keep asking, how do you know Mocharat Shabbat really means the day after Yom Tov? Maybe it really means literally the day after Shabbat Breshit, meaning the day after Sunday. The day after Shabbat, which is Sunday. Amarta v'chine emar mimocharat Shabbat shebetoch haPesach halo lo ne'emar ela mimocharat Shabbat. So he says to the Baytusim, your whole claim is mimocharat Shabbat really means the day after Shabbat, which means Sunday. But what's Sunday? To kol hashana kulam alei Shabbatot, the entire year, there's 52 Sundays in the year. Seyu bedok ezo Shabbat. According to you, why would it specifically be the Shabbat after, right? After the first day of Pesach? Maybe it's any Shabbat. Ve'od, now comes Rabbi Yossi with a second claim, and this is why there's 5 claims but only 4 rabbis in this braita, because he has 2 claims, and his second claim is going to be exactly the same as Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira said in the first braita. Ve'od, ne'emar Shabbat lamata, ve'ne'emar Shabbat lamala, and the pasuk, right, Mimocharat Shabbat, if you remember in Vayikra Kaf Gimel, it's at the bottom of your page here, Tevav and Tetzayin, Sfartem lachem Mimocharat Shabbat, and that's all about the Omer. And then it says, mimorchat Shabbat Shvi'it, after the last Shabbat, in the 7th week, right, then Yikraftem Mincha Chadasha Hashem. So, right, until that time you should be counting, and then do the Mincha Hashem, which is the Shtei Alechem, Ma Lahalan Regel Utchilat Regel, Avkan Regel Utchilat Regel. This was the Gzera Shava. Since in Shavuot, the Shabbat there refers to the beginning of the holiday, because you do it on Shavuot. Also here, I was referring to the beginning of the holiday. You do it on the first day, right after the first day of Pesach. Last claim, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Katuv Echad Omer, Sheshet Yabim Tochal Matzot. Ukatuv Echad Omer, Shivat Yamim Matzot Tochelu. Now we're in a completely different place. Very strange psukim, and talking of learning for Pesach, right? So you might remember, we learned this in Pesachim. There's a very strange pasuk, and it says 6 days you should eat matzah. What does it mean? 6 days you should eat matzah. And then it says 7 days you should eat matzah. Is it 6 days? 7 days, right? We know it's 7 days. So what's this pasuk? 6 days you should eat matzah. Now there's many different interpretations given for this. This is just one of many. HaKetzad, how does this work? Well, there's something that you eat only matzah for 6 days of. What's that? Matzah she'iyat hayachol ochla shiv'a min hachadash. Ata yachol ochla shisha min hachadash. You can't eat matzah made from chadash wheat for 7 days, because you can't eat it when? The first day. In other words, there's only 6 days that you can eat matzah made from chadash, from the new wheat. Why is that? Because you can't use the new grains until after the first day of Pesach. So that leaves you 6 more days to eat matzah. And that's a very creative way to explain the contradiction there. Okay, that's the end of this long braita with all of the different claims. Now, before we go on, and I promised you Rava's going to come and start knocking down one by one these approaches and leave a few of them. But before we do that, we're still in the braita. And the braita, and this is why I bolded certain words in the psukim, we're now going to darshan a bunch of words in this psukim to get to how do we know, we learned in the previous Mishna that we do the cutting of the harvesting of the crop at night. We also know we count starting at night. And then we bring the Omer to the temple, right, and deal with it and bring the sacrifice all on during the day. So where do we get that all from? So miyom haviachem tisperu. Okay, so now they're going to say, okay, it's not exactly what it says in the pasuk, but it says usfartem lachem miyom achorat Shabbat miyom haviachem et Omer tnufa. So you count from the day after Shabbat, which was what our whole discussion was about. Now we're getting to the next words in that pasuk. From the day you bring the Omer tnufa. So now you would think, Yachol Yiktzor V'Yavi, Ve'matai Shirtzei Yispol. It sounds like count from the day, but you could explain that as once you bring the Omer, then at some point you could decide when you want to start counting. It's a bit of a ridiculous suggestion, but right, there's no particular day you do the count. It's just some day after you already brought the korban. So, in other words, definitely bring the korban on that day, Shabbat, which again they think is Tetzayin B'Nisan. Cut it, bring it, but maybe you don't need to count. Talmud Lamal. No, but then there's another pasuk, and this is what they're trying to tell you. Me'echel chamesh b'kama tachel lispol. Okay, that's in Dvarim Tetzayin. Okay, it's a different section where it also says Shiva Shavuot Tispor Lach, count 7 weeks. That was the Tispor Lach that we saw before. When you put the sickle into the grains, that's when you start to count. Shiva Shavuot. So there it makes it pretty clear that you can't just count at some point after you bring the Omer. It has to be that day. Okay. If you just take that literally, Yachol, we still wouldn't have gotten to what we do nowadays. Why? Yachol Yiktzor V'Yispol. Then it sounds like, okay, the harvesting and the counting have to happen on the same day. But maybe Yom HaVyachem could be later. Talmud Lamar, Miyom HaVyachem. No, but you can't say that because it says, Usfartem Lachem Miyom HaVyachem. So clearly, the Sfirah, and as what they're basically saying in simple terms is, in Dvarim Tetzayin, the counting is connected to the harvesting. In Vayikra Kaf Gimel, the counting is connected to the offering, bringing the offering. So therefore, it must be that it relates to both of them. Okay, that both of them, they all have to happen on the same day. Okay, now I told you though, we still have to get to, how do you know that some of them happen at night and some happen during the day? So, Imi Yom HaVyachem, now, Miyom HaVyachem, notice it says from the day. That sounds like daytime. So if we just connected all these things, right? If the Yom Yachem is when you count, and Mechel Chamesh Bakama is when you count, then all that must happen at the same time. All of it happens during the day. But what's the problem? Talmud Lamal, Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot Tiena. Emataya Talmud says Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot. It says you have to have 7 complete weeks. Now, if you're going to count 7 complete weeks, how are you going to end up with 7 complete weeks? Since the day starts at night, you have to start counting at night. Otherwise, you won't have 7 complete weeks. If you start during the day, you've already missed half a day. So, Yachol Yiktzor V'Yaviv Yispor Balayla. So maybe then, okay, now we move everything. We shift it to nighttime. Talmud Lamar Miyom Aviyachem HaKetzad. So now we have this, right? Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot Tiena at the end of that same pasuk where it says Miyom Aviyachem. Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot Tiena indicates we have to start counting at night. And what did we say from Dvarim Tetzayim? We also have to count when we do the Tzirah. That's going to get you that the counting and the harvesting have to happen at night. Miyom Aviyachem tells you that the offering has to be brought during the day, which by the way makes sense because no offerings were brought at night in the temple. You could have said maybe they make an exception, but that explains all of it now. Okay, so we finished that. So haketzad, tzira, usfira balayla, and haba abayom. So the harvesting and the counting start at night, and the bringing it happens during the day. Okay, now that's the end of the braita. So that was the whole braita, the second braita that started with Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda that we ended yesterday's daf with. That all right, and then ended with this whole section where we darshan these psukim about the timing. Amar Rava. Now comes Rava, and we're going to go one by one, and with this we'll do a review of all the opinions. Kulu ilu pircha bar mitarte tanai batrai, ben b'manita kamaita, ben b'manita batraita delelu pircha. All of these have a pircha. Pircha means a difficulty, except for, all of them, except for the last two, whether we're talking about the first braita or the second braita. Okay, so basically now, I just want to give you the structure because there's 10 listed all together, but 9 rabbis, because remember, Rabbi Yossi makes 2 claims. And there's really, in the end, only 8 claims because 2 overlap. Rabbi Eliezer says the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda ben Beter in the second braita, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beter in the first braita is the same thing as Rabbi Yossi's second commentary in the second braita. So we end up with 8 claims in the name of 9 rabbis, and listed as 10 different individual claims because there's 5 in one and 5 in the other. So there's a lot of different ways to count this. So now what he's saying is like this. If you look through each braita, we're going to have difficulties on the first 3, and the last 2 claims in each braita are left without difficulties. Okay, so let's go. They're going to go now. Rava's going to go one by one according to the order. Okay, so now. It's interesting. They never make reference, and this is why I did it in the chart, to the fact that there's overlaps here. Okay, they just keep looking at 1 braita, 2 braitas, and going on. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who said basically we have this contradiction. Tis peru 50 yom. It says count 50 days, which sounds like you count from wherever day you're up to. Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot Tiena sounds like 7 complete weeks. The week has to start on Sunday. So there it sounds like it always starts on Sunday. Tis peru 50 yom sounds like it could start any day of the week. How do we resolve that? He said, it must be when Pesach falls on Shabbat, then we count 7 complete weeks. When it falls in the middle of the week, we count 50 days from wherever we're up to. So they say, Dilma Kadabai, who says that's a difficulty that needs resolving in the way that you resolved it? Maybe you could say like Abaye, Amar Abaye, and this is what I said when we first said it, because that's the way we always read these 2 psukim. Mitzvah lemimne yomei, mitzvah lemimne shavuei. There's 2 different commandments. One is to count days, one is to count weeks, right? We all know this because that's how we count the Omer. We say, today is 7 days, which is 1 week, okay? Or 8 days, which is 1 week and 1 day. We do both. And that's where we get it from. That's why it talks about days. That's why it talks about weeks. Therefore, there's no difficulty that you're bringing this conclusion of where you get the day from. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, the next 2, they're going to go together. They're going to have the same difficulty on both, even though they're very different. But Rabbi Eliezer was tispor lach, which means it's tuluya bebeitin, and Shabbat Breshit basically is, anyone can count it. They don't need a court to tell you what the date is because it's always Sunday. And Rabbi Yeshua says we had the Chodesh Yamim in the Slav story, and we had the Yamim leading up to Shavuot. Just like in a Chodesh, you know how to count from the previous month. There's like a date to start with to get your count. Also here, you know where to count from a particular date, meaning you're going to get to Shavuot from counting from the day after Pesach. Now, if you do it based on Sunday, then there's no clear date that we can go back to, okay? That these things are related to dates and they're not related to days of the week. That's basically, both of them seem to say it's also related. In the end, they're both kind of saying the same thing, just learning it very differently, but that it's related to days on a calendar and not days of the week. So the Gemara, Rava questions us and says, Mimai de biyom tov rishon kai, tilma biyom tov acharon kai. They ask a very good question. They said, okay, well, we understand you're saying it has to be based on a calendar and a date on the calendar, but who's to say that the date on the calendar is Tet Zayin B'Nisan? Maybe it's the day after, maybe it's a week later, or a little less than a week later, but the day after the last day of Pesach. In other words, you want to say Mimochat Shabbat. Shabbat is Yom Tov. But there's two Yom Tovs on Pesach. There's Yom Tov on the first day of Pesach, Tefav, and then there's Yom Tov on the seventh day of Pesach. Maybe it's the day after the seventh day of Pesach. So your theory is very nice, but doesn't prove Tet Zayin B'Nisan specifically. And we're going to come back to this argument later as well. So with that, we got rid of the first three, and the last two we have no difficulty on, which is both of them were also kind of similar. They both compared the Omer to the Shtei Alechem, either by content, that Chadash, they both permit Chadash, the new crop, or because there's a Gzeira Shabbat and Shabbat. It says Shabbat in both psukim. Since the Shtei Alechem comes on Shavuot at the beginning of the holiday, this one comes at the beginning of the holiday. That resolves the previous question we just had. And, it seems like a reasonable drasha. There's really no difficulty to be said on that. Next, Imi de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Now we're going to that 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, which was very strange. And the Gemara is going to reject it because it's basically saying if you have to count 50 days, right, it's always going to be 50. But if you're basically going to say it starts from Sunday, then some years it will be more than 50 after Tet Zayin B'Nisan. Now, who picked Tet Zayin B'Nisan? That's only the rabbis have Tet Zayin B'Nisan. So the whole thing was a little strange. Like, why are we assuming that 50 days you're going to end up with 55 if you start later because we're really counting from the day after Pesach? Something was a little weird about that. The Gemara is going to also question it. Rava is going to question. Hava mina dilma chamishim levar mehaneshita. What he basically says is the same thing that I said, but in different words. You would have thought it's 50 from wherever you start counting, like minus those 6 from the day after Pesach. In other words, assuming you're at the latest date possible, the Chamishi V'Shisha, he's using one example. If, Pesach comes out on a Sunday, and then you only start counting the following Sunday, then when you count 50 days, you're counting from that Sunday. You're not including those 6 days of Pesach that, weren't relevant. So that's just, it's basically saying in different words what I said before. Now, to Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Oh, sorry, no, I just went back accidentally. Imi to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Okay, now we're up to the second one. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, who basically said the same thing as Rabbi Eliezer. So we're going to have the exact same difficulty, which is Mimai de biyom tov rishon kai, dilma biyom tov acharon kai. Right? If it's all tluya bebeitin and it has to be a date in the calendar, again, it's just not clear it has to be that date. It could be the next yantif and counting from the last day. Rabbi Yossi Nami hachazele pirka v'hainu de ka'amravot. This is a bit of an interesting way of saying it. So they don't really tell you the difficulty on the first Rabbi Yossi. But what they're telling you is, obviously Rabbi Yossi had a difficulty with what his claim was, because Rabbi Yossi himself said, ve'od, he brought 2 claims. Whenever someone brings 2 claims, it's like we talked about yesterday. If there's 10 answers here, or really in the end 8 answers, but obviously none of them are really strong enough, because otherwise why would you have? And particularly if you're one person bringing 2 arguments, you're obviously trying to prove, why do you bring a second one? Because your first one you didn't think was strong enough. Now, the commentaries tell us what's the difficulty, and it's the same one we've been asking for everyone else. Because what did Rabbi Yossi say? It says, right? How do you know it could be any Shabbat of the year? Well, for all intents and purposes, it could be the second Yantif of Pesach, like we said before. So, saying Shabbat is the day after Yantif still doesn't mean it's after the first day. Nothing of what you claimed, right, is going to prove it's the first day. Again, and that was the strength of the second Rabbi Yossi, because Shabbat Lamata, Shabbat Lamala, just like on Shavuot, it's the beginning of the holiday. Also here, it's the beginning of the holiday. Okay, so that one works. And the Sheshet Yamim, the Shivat Yamim also works, because there's really no difficulty. That seems to be a good, clear proof, right? Of all of them, it kind of seems the strongest, right? Even though there are other ways to resolve that contradiction. But Sheshet Yamim Tocha Matzot, right, actually is a pretty good proof The 6 days you can eat matzah from the new crop, because the first day you're going to bring the Omer on the second day, and that's when you'll be permitted to eat from the new crop. Okay, that's the end of that section. We have one small thing to do before we move on to the next Mishnah, which is just go back to this counting days and counting weeks. So gufa. Gufa always means we're going to go in depth into something mentioned previously. Amar Abai, mitzvah l'mimnei yomei, mitzvah l'mimnei shavuei. You have to count the days, you have to count the weeks. It's a mitzvah to count both. Rabbanan debei Rav Ashi, mani yomei umani shavuei. And the rabbis, in fact, in the house of in the Beit Midrash of Rav Ashi, this is what they did. But a Meimar, mani yomei v'lo mani shavuei, he counted days, he didn't count weeks. Why? Amar zecher l'mikdash. We said nowadays that there's no korban Omer, so we don't need to count the weeks anymore. Okay, what is this? Why, if you're going to, it obviously makes more sense to count days and not weeks, right? One way to say it is, if you're going to drop one, so drop that one. But it really goes better with the pasuk that we saw before, which is, Shiv'a shavuot tispor lecha mehechel chamesh bakama. Techel ispor shiv'a shavuot. By the way, it's a whole interesting pasuk in itself. It repeats itself in the second part and the first part. But the main part being the weeks seem to go with the harvesting. If you're no longer harvesting because there's no temple and you're not bringing the Omer, then there's no reason to count weeks. That's the theory. Okay, but obviously we don't hold like him, but that's what he claims. Okay. Now we're back to the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is back to describing the process. Okay, so we have the process of the harvesting. Now we get to the temple. What do we do with it in the temple? So now I'm just going to read you a pasuk that we saw before, which is in Vayikra chapter 2, verse 14. It talks about this mincha bikurim, which the rabbis assume is talking about the korban Omer. Im takriv mincha bikurim laHashem, aviv kaloi be'esh, geres karmel takriv mincha bikurecha. So now we're going to understand this psukim. What does it mean, aviv kaloi be'esh? Okay, geres karmel takriv mincha bikurecha. So we have to understand those psukim. So now we're going to say, well, what do we do? So they put it in the boxes. Remember, they had to take 3 kupot for the 3 people. So they bring it to the Azara, and this is all going to take place in the Azara, temple courtyard. Okay, they would take the bundles. Okay, they're still sheaves. Okay, the sheaves of barley. And the issue is they want to dry it out. Why are they drying it out? Well, to make flour, you have to dry it out. And it says kali in the pasuk. So it says kaloi, right? It says kaloi be'esh. So you have to dry it, like roast it in the fire. So what do? They would wave the bundles. There would be a fire going, and they would wave the bundles in front, and that would dry them out. Kedei l'kayem bo mitzvat kali. Okay, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of kali, according to the Torah, deriving Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim, bikanim ubekolchot chovtin oto, kedei shelo yitma'ech. Then, I'll explain all this in a minute, nitanuhu la'abuv, he basically says the process of roasting them or toasting them happens after you separate them from the when you end up with just the grains. Okay, you do threshing and winnowing and all that. That happens before. Then you toast the kernels. Okay, now and then we'll see. He puts it in nabuv. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what's the problem? And this goes to the very beginning of what he said. The problem is that they're very soft at this point. They're not dried out. And if you start threshing them when they're so moist, then you're going to end up crushing them. And we don't want them crushed. We want them to be in good shape. So you would specifically do the threshing not with hard implements, but soft things like reeds. And that's kanim. And kolchim are like, what do you call it? Like cabbage stalks basically. So you take stalks of cabbage or reeds and you would basically pound them with something soft so that they won't get crushed. And then you separate the wheat from the chaff in that way. And then nitanu la'abuv, then you put it in an abuv, which actually is it's a musical instrument that's like a chaliyah, like a flute. Okay, it's a type of flute kind of instrument which has holes, right? So it's a metal thing with holes in it. But it's empty in the inside. You put it inside, and then you put the fire underneath, and because there's holes, they get roasted inside. Okay, so the abuv was minukav, it had holes in it, kadeshia ol shalet bekulo, so that the fire can get inside. Shtachuhu ba'azara. Now what happens? After you toast them, like anything, right, you spread them out, because otherwise if you pile them up, they'll get moist again from the heat. from the sweating of them and the smoke coming, the smoke coming out of it, or the, I don't know if the word, not smoke, but the edim. Can't think of the word in English right now, but you know what I mean. The steam. Thank you. Okay, so now so they spread them out in the temple courtyard, and the wind would come and dry out the grains, help them dry. Then they would put them in these millstones. Okay, so now they would still be grusot. They would still be with the bran in it. Okay, and it would be with the pieces of the peel, and then they would start the process that we learned about that we've talked about, the 13. Right, they would put them in the 13. Actually, we didn't learn about it. I think. Right, we didn't get to that yet. I prepared the Shabbat daf. I guess maybe it's there. Let me just double check. No, maybe we did it. Did we do the 13? Oh, we didn't do it. Okay, so we're going to learn that. Sorry, my confusion. That's what happens when I prepare in advance. So it's going to go through a process of 13 siftings. Okay, we're going to talk about that. And then, now what happens? So we're going to take this 3 se'ah, which we learned is an ephah. We're going to whittle it down to 1/10 of its size, to an isaron. And then, what do we do with the rest of it? Okay, you now have all this solet, and now that you're not using, right? It's not actually solet, it's more, right, it has all the, the debris in it and other stuff. But what are you going to do with the rest of it? So, you redeem it. In other words, it's sanctified. You redeem it, and then it can be eaten by anybody. And you're chayav in challah. Okay, why are you chayav in challah? Now, here we get to challah maser, completely different topic. If you have something that belongs to you, you have to take challah, right, if it's a dough, and you have to do maser if it's, right, anything you need to tithe. But by maser, it says digancha, your own dagan. Okay? Now, we learned 2 things from digancha. One is it has to be when it's called dagan. When does that happen? What we call gemar melacha. When it's complete. When is it complete, or when is it considered, like finished? Not while it's in the ground, not after you harvest it, only once you did the threshing, did the winnowing, put it in a pile, and then you flatten the top of the pile. The flattening top of the pile is called meruach hakri. The kri is the pile, meruach is to flatten it. You flatten out the top of the pile, that's called gemar melacha. Now, if it's in your possession, at gemar melacha, you're chayav. If it's not in your possession at gemar melacha, you're patur for maser. Okay, if it was hekdesh at the time, which this was, right, when they did the meruach hakri, it was hekdesh, right? The whole thing was hekdesh from the beginning. So, basically, it's patur for maser. But challah, it's chayav, because when you chayav in challah, okay, we all know when you make challah, when you do the dough, when the dough's ready, at this point, if I take that stuff, I redeemed it, it's no longer hekdesh, and then I made a challah out of it. Of course, I'm chayav to give challah to the kohen. Rabbi Akiva mechayev b'challah uvemaschot. Rabbi Akiva has a strange position, which the Gemara is going to struggle to understand why. You're chayav, also maser. Doesn't make any sense according to what I just told you, so we'll have to wait and see. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, so now braita starts off and says, Aviv ze aviv. Okay, that's very helpful. Okay, so this is basically what they're saying is this is the barley kernel. Okay, Aviv, it's just saying what it is. The barley kernel. Kaloi be'esh. Milamed shayisrael mahavevim oto be'esh kedei lekayem bo b'tzvat kali. So kaloi be'esh teaches you, and this is what Rabbi Meir said, that you have to wave it fan it in front of the fire in order to do mitzvah kali, divrei Rabbi Meir. And here in this braita, it also is Rabbi Meir. Turning now to Amud Bet, Chachamim omrim, ein or lashon kali ela davar achil. When it says, what they're saying here is, what they mean is that it has to be done with davar achir. This is the rabbis. It can't be done. It's not by waving it and fanning it in front of a flame. It has to go into something else. That's what kali means. Okay, it means in something else. Now, the second opinion is some other people say ein lashon kali ela kalil. Kalil here it seems to mean shiny, meaning it goes in some shiny utensil. Either which way we get to the fact, it has to go in a nabuv, okay, which was a shiny metal utensil that was shiny, and also it was something separating it that wasn't in the fire, right? It was in a fire using some sort of vessel. HaKetzad, so how would you fulfill this? One of these 2 things. Abuv shel klayot hayasham, v'hu menukav kikvara. It has holes like a sifter. Kadesh te'a'ol sholet b'kulo, so that the fire gets the whole thing. This is very similar to the language used in the Mishna. Aviv kaloi geres. Okay, now we have to read the pasuk again. If you're going to do mincha bikurim la'Hashem, aviv, okay, the barley, kaloi be'esh, which we learned now what it is, geres. Now, geres, Carmel, takrivet mincha bikurecha. Geres means the flour. It's like the solet of the barley. So it's the flour itself, which is after it's ground. So now the question becomes, is it singed before it's ground or singed after it's ground? So, right, until now we kind of said it was singed before. The question is, how do we get that from the pasuk? Because remember, it's still grains. Even according to the rabbis, they have a later stage, right, with Rabbi Meir, it was still on the stalks. With the rabbis, it was already off the stalks, but it was still grains, it wasn't flour. So now they're going to say, Aviv kaloi geres. So the question is, where do you put the comma in that sentence? Ani odea im aviv kaloi im geres kaloi. I don't know if it's kaloi as aviv, because the aviv comes before the kaloi, or it's roasted as geres, as flour, which it says after. Omer be'esh hifsika inyan. Because they said the kaloi, it says kaloi be'esh, then you know to take a break there in the pasuk, and then the geres Carmel is the continuation. Carmel. What is this word Carmel? What does that mean? Rach umal. So they say this is what we call notricon. It's when we take a word and we say, oh, this is short for this and this is short for that. It's like an abbreviation, but it's one word, right? Usually abbreviations in the English language, it would be, right, one letter for one, right, and then another letter for another. That's an abbreviation. This is taking a word and kind of splitting it and saying this is short for this and this is short for that. And with that, you get a whole picture. So we're going to have a whole bunch of examples for you to see this. First is Carmel, Rach v'mal. Now, this is a little tricky. They took Kar and they switched the order to Rach, soft and fresh, or soft and moist. V'chein hu omer, right? This is the opinion that basically you have to do it when it's soft still, right, and not after it's hardened. V'chein hu omer v'ish ba mibal shalisha v'yaveh leish Elohim. It's actually interesting. They're going to bring a pasuk where they're going to teach you a notrikon of the word tziklono, but the whole pasuk clearly sounds like what very similar to the words we're talking about. There's going to be barley, there's going to be Carmel, but they don't do the notrikon of Carmel here. They do it of this word tziklono. Okay, we're in Sefer Melachim. There was a person who came from Baal Shalisha, v'yaveh leish Elohim lechem bikurim, v'esurim lechem sorim. Okay, he brings, right, not only that bikurim is mentioned here, right, he brings bread of his first crop, esrim lechem sorim, 20 loaves of barley, v'karmel, bis tziklono. V'yomar, ten la'am v'yochelu. And he says, give to the people and they'll eat. So what do they say here? What's tziklono? Ba v'yatzak lanu, v'achalnu, v'daveh haya lanu. He came and he gave us, and we ate. He divided it up. He gave it to us, and it was very good. Okay, that's tziklono. It was a way of, yatzak lanu. He poured us, va'achalnu, and we ate, and naveh. It was nice. La haya. Okay, that's tzik yatzak achalnu. Lamed vav was achalnu, and nun vav was naveh. Ve'omer, another pasuk in Mishle, nit al saba havim. This time about a woman who seduces another man. It's a woman, no effet, who commits adultery. So what's nit al sa ba'havim and her people she loved? Or nisa v'nitein. She said, let's talk, let's schmooze. V'na'aleh, and we'll go up. V'nismach, and we'll enjoy. V'nitchate ba'havim, and we'll sin with love. Or with the one she loves. Ve'omer, another pasuk, which actually is a very similar word, but they're going to darshan it completely differently. Kenaf l'nanim ne'elasa. This is discussing a type of bird. I think in the Quran they say it's an ostrich, although in the Shansim they seem to say it's not clear what kind of bird it is. Let me just see for a minute. Is that right? That it says an ostrich? No, maybe not. Did I see that? No, maybe not. Okay. No, it's just a bird. Okay. No, actually that's why I'm in the wrong place. Yeah, the ostrich. Okay. It does say ostrich. So according to that, it's an ostrich. It's talking in Eov. This is God saying, I'm all powerful. I make these unbelievable things. Like, what do you complain? You think I don't have hashgacha pratit in the world, and you think I wasn't, this just happened randomly. Nothing happens randomly. Knaf renanim ne'elasa. So the wings of this bird, let's call it the ostrich, or ne'elasa. What does that mean? Noseh va'olev v'nitchate. When she puts her, what do you call it? Lays her eggs, So they basically say that it's she nosei ne'elasa, she goes up. Nosei, she carries the eggs. Ola, she goes up. V'nitchatein, she puts them specifically in their place. Okay, meaning she doesn't just randomly just dump her eggs somewhere, right? It's very thought out. Okay, next. Omer, last one. Oh, well, almost last one. We'll call it the last one in this list, and then you'll see why. That's a good word, deliberate. Thank you. Very deliberate. Omer ki yarat haderech lenegdi. Now we're in Bilam's story, and the malach goes to Bilam, and then basically he has this section, which unclear what exactly this means, but the drasha is yareta rata v'nateta. The yarat haderech lenegdi is the malach is saying, when I appeared, the donkey yarat haderech. Okay, what does that mean? Yareta, rata, and nateta. Okay, yud yareta, rata resh, and nateta from the tet. So the donkey sensed I was there, feared me, saw me, and then maybe sensed it. So first didn't see, just feared, then saw me, and then went the other way. Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana. Okay, so that was all the different examples of the notrikon. Now, Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana Carmel Carmele. So now they say another explanation of Carmel, another notrikon, but this wasn't brought as the examples of notrikon. This is a different example of how to understand the word Carmel in a notrikon. And it goes a little better with the words, which is Carmele, which means it's a full pillow now, like a pillow. But what it really means is it's ripened completely. Okay, and that's where you have to take the crop that's ripened completely. Now we're moving on. Rabbi Akiva, mechayev b'chalav v'masrot. Okay, so that was all about the process and where we get it from the psukim, and the aviv kaloi, and the carmel, and how we get, the process in the temple of the singeing. Now, once it's done, we then said you take all this solet that you had, or you made the solet, the 10th of the solet, which was the purest, the best, and then all the rest of it, all the rest of it needs to, can go be redeemed. And then the question is, do you need to take Truma and Masra from it or not? So, Amar Rav Kahana, Omer Haya Rabbi Akiva, we really didn't understand. It made a lot of sense to say there's no Masir, because what happened, the Meruach HaKri, when it becomes Chayav, right now the Meruach HaKri happens when it was in the possession of the Hekdesh. Okay? So because of that, it's not obligated in Masir. Amar Rav Kahana, so why does Rabbi Meir say it is? He must hold, Omer Haya Rabbi Akiva, Meruach Hekdesh Eino Potel. The fact that you do the Meruach when it's in the Hekdesh doesn't exempt you. Okay? Now, it's not really clear what he means, and in the end we're going to completely say this is totally wrong. But either he means that if eventually you redeem it and it gets to the hands of individuals, they're going to have to do Maasir, even though previously, right, at the time of Meruach HaKri, it was in the hands of Hekdesh. Now that it moved to someone else's hands, well, they're obligated. That's probably what he means, because otherwise it would be hard to say that any time in the temple you have to take Truma and Masra. Well, then how do you doing the Yisaron? The Yisaron, no one Masra the Yisaron. Then you're going to take something that's called Tevel that doesn't have Truma and Masra taken, and you're going to burn it on the altar. That would seem weird. But probably he means that if it ends up in the hands of an individual, later, like in this case, because it was redeemed, you have to take Truma and Masra anyway. Mativ Rav Shesha says it can't be that this is what Rabbi Akiva says, because look at the following source. Motar Shalosh Sein, the leftover of the Shalosh Sein, Halalu, Mahayosim, but what would you do with it? This is basically very parallel to our Mishnah until a certain point. Nifdev v'ne'echal l'chol adam, so it's redeemed and eaten by anybody. V'chayav b'chala u'patur min ha'maschot. Okay, that's Tanakama, Rabbi Akiva, v'chayav b'chala u'maschot, same thing. But here we have a retort of the rabbis to Rabbi Akiva, and this is the important line. Amrulo, they said to him, Podem yad gizbar yochiach. We're going to take an example where we know that you agree with me, which is if you redeem it from a gizbar, you take something, you give to the temple, there was Meruach HaKri, right, in the time while it was in the Hekdesh, and then you redeem it, you're, okay, according to this, Shechaya b'chalav, Patur min ha'masrot, everybody knows it's exempt from Maser, and you would agree with me. Now, im ita de Meruach Hekdesh eno poter, now if Rabbi Akiva really thought that Meruach Hekdesh does not exempt, Maika Amrle, he. Then what are they saying? It's the exact same thing, basically. Okay, in other words, you're basically saying that it's the exact same case. Meruach HaKri happened in the possession of the temple, And here Rabbi Akiva exempts. So it can't be Meiruach Hakri, you're obligated. Okay, and it's the same thing where it gets redeemed and it's in the hands of an individual. So that can't possibly be. And Rabbi Akiva doesn't say, I don't agree with that, right? He just doesn't respond. So he obviously agrees with that. The Chachamim knew he agreed with it. So it seems like he does think these things are exempt. So why would he be Mechayev? Okay, and in addition, okay, and this is going to actually give us the reason, Eitive Rav Kana bar Tachlif ala Rav Kana. Okay, Rav Kana was the one who said that Rabbi Akiva holds Meiruach Hakri and Potel. But Rav Kana says he doesn't hold that because listen to this braita. Rabbi Akiva mechayev b'chalav v'maschot lefisha lo nitnu ma'ot ela l'tzorech lehen. He says explicitly why, and it's not the reason you said. Now, what is it? And here we're going to see the real reason. Rabbi Akiva claims that what was the problem? This was in hekdesh. And when it was in hekdesh, it shouldn't be chayav v'maser, right? Because the Meiruach Hakri happened while it was in hekdesh. But since what happens here is you take the money, you buy these 3 se'ah, which is a whole ephah. You know you're going to end up with only a tenth, because that's the whole idea. You're going to basically sift it down until you get to a tenth. Well, what's going to happen then? What happens really? When you take the money and you pay for it, and basically you take sanctified money and you pay for something, the money goes only on the part you're going to actually really need, the tenth. Now, you don't know which tenth at this point, but that's what we call braita, if you remember. Later, it'll be retroactively determined that this was where the hekdesh was. And the hekdesh was never on the rest of it. So it wasn't like Meiruach Hakri happened in the hands of hekdesh, because the rest of it was never sanctified. I'll give you an example that's totally different. But it's like when you buy a banana, okay? When you buy a banana, you buy it by weight. Let's say you buy it by weight, right? Let's say in Israel, they always buy it by weight. They never sell it by, bundles. Sometimes in America, you can buy like a set of, 5 bananas cost whatever. But anyway, you buy it by weight. You don't. Now, what's in the weight? The peel of the banana. Now, you don't want the peel, right? But you pay for it. It's just included. So when you buy any saron, you're buying really the saron, even though you're really buying 3 se'ahs worth, okay? Because the kedusha is going just on that. So therefore, Elam Rabbi Yochanan Talmud Aruchu Befiv Shel Rabbi Akiva Shalon Inu Maot El Tzorach Lem, and he basically says that's the reason also. And Amar Rava says the same thing. Pshita li Demiruach Hekdesh Potel. It's obvious to me. If it's Meiruach happens in hekdesh, for sure it exempts. And Afilu Rabbi Akiva lo kama chayav hatam. Rabbi Akiva only obligated here. Okay, because again, the only thing that was sanctified was the 10th of that whole thing. So once you separate it out, basically the 10th of it, the 9/10 of it was never sanctified to begin with, and that's why they're obligated in Maser. But now Rava ends with this other statement, which with this will end the daf. Okay, so Meiruach Hekdesh in general exempts. However, Meiruach ha'ovei kochavim tenaihi. But what if the Meiruach happened when it's the possession of a Gentile? That's a machloket tanaim. Now he's going to read this machloket tanaim and explain it in a particular way. Not everybody agrees that this is the way to understand it. The Yerushalmi understands this differently. He thinks the machloket that we're going to explain right now is based on, okay, now let's think about it. It was owned by a Gentile, and then you bought it from the Gentile. So the question is, did you buy it before it was put in the pile? If so, obviously you're chayav because you put it in the pile and did the flattening of the pile. But what if you bought it from the Gentile, and the flattening of the pile happened in the Gentile's possession, and you bought it later? Is it chayav in maaser? So first of all, you have to understand that if a Gentile, there's a machloket, and that's what the Yerushalmi thinks is a machloket here, but I'm not going to get into that right now. There's a machloket about whether a Gentile's property in Israel, you're chayav in truma maaser by on a Torah level, or is it just rabbinic? Okay, but this Rava assumes that everyone agrees here that it's Torah level obligation. The question is just, does it have to be in your possession? In other words, is that only if you bought it and then the pile happened when it was in your possession? But if the flattening of the pile didn't happen in your possession, maybe not. And that's the machlokah we're going to see right here. Titania, they say it in a bit of a different way, but you'll see. Tormim mishal Yisrael al shel Yisrael, mishal avdei kochavim al shel avdei kochavim, mishal kutim al shel kutim. Here, this braita all thinks kutim were like Gentiles. They were converts, the Shomronim, but they converted according to some people because they were forced, and because of that, they're not real converts. So they're treated like Gentiles. Okay, so each one, in other words, if I have a pile of truma of a Jew and another pile of truma of a Jew, I could take from one on the other. Of crops. And then I want to take truma from one to the other, or Gentiles, or kutim. But mishal kol al shal kol. Also, if you have a mixture, you have some that was Jews and some that I bought from a Gentile or bought from a kuti, I can take truma masra one on the other. Okay, now according to that, it's deriving Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rava, what's the reason for that? because they're all obligated in the same level. It's all Torah level. And even if the pile happened in the time of the Gentile, it's still obligated, right? It's still as if it happened in my possession, though it's still going to be obligated because I bought it eventually, so I'm obligated. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, Omrim, Tormim Shel Yisrael, Al Shel Yisrael, Shel Avdei Kochavim, Al Shel Kutim, Shel Kutim, Al Shel Avdei Kochavim. Avdei Kochavim, Kutim, same level, because they're all considered Gentiles. Jews, different level. Right? Lo mishal Yisrael al shel avdei kochavim shel kutim, but lo mishal avdei kochavim shel kutim al shel Yisrael. Because if the pile happened in their possession, again, this is the way Rava understands it. If the pile happened in their possession, then you're not chayav in truma u'maasrot on a Torah level. And because of that, you can't mix, because remember, you can't do chayav ala pator and pator ala chayav. You can't take truma from something using something that doesn't have the same level of obligation. Again, the Yerushalmi, they think this whole machloket is, are you even obligated in Truma U'Maasrot on Ovdei Kochavim or not? Because maybe the fact that they bought land in Israel uproots the Kedusha and it's no longer sanctified. So that's a whole other way of understanding this machloket, but Rava explains it to be connected with our topic. Okay, with that we finish. Let's try to sum it up quickly. We had the 10, again, list of 10, which was really 9 rabbis, 8 reasons altogether of the arguments the rabbis brought against the Baytusi. Most of them were rejected. We're left really with 3 because there's 4, but 2 overlap, right? The last 2 in each one, but 2 are the same. So 3 arguments that weren't rejected. In that, we also had how we get to the timing of when the counting happens, when the harvesting happens, and when the Omer is brought, right? What time of day. Then, right, nighttime, daytime. Then we got to exactly how they do it, how they do the singeing. We talked about that and where we get it from the psukim. And then we talked about is the rest that's left over after we've sifted through and gotten down the flour to the fine solet that we're looking for, the special solet that we're looking for. What's the story with the rest of it? We can redeem it. And then there's this debate, is a chayav and masrot or not? And it has to do with, in the end, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva was explained as that really the Kedusha never went on the other 9/10. Okay, but if it had, then it would have been exempt from Maser, because any hekdesh, when the Meruach happens in the possession of the hekdesh, is exempt from Maser. And then there was the whole question about what's the chiyuv if the pile happened in the hands of a non-Jew, in the possession of a non-Jew, would you be obligated Maser or not? And that was a machloket Tanaim. And again, it was some machloket that Rava understood to be connected to our topic, but it's not necessarily with that, because it never said anything about the pile in the hands of the Gentile. It was just saying, right, that's how he understood the machloket to be connected to this topic. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, safe day. I saw a lot of people had to leave in the middle of this year for sirens. Luckily, it didn't happen here, so we didn't have to start our class today. But wishing safety to everybody.